In a world filled with unhealed wounds and buried secrets, two people, a man returning after years of absence and a woman who has endured every pain alone, are forced to confront their past to save their future. When the farm her mother left behind teeters on the brink of collapse, Ethan returned with a promise never to walk away again. But can Elena trust him after everything that has happened? Can they overcome their pain, mend a long-forgotten relationship, and rebuild from the ruins? This is not just a story about the recovery of a piece of land. It's a journey of broken hearts, unfulfilled promises, and emotions suppressed for a lifetime. Get ready to witness a fierce struggle, not just between two individuals, but a battle to rediscover trust, love, and hope. Thank you for supporting our channel. Stay tuned for more captivating stories at Mr. Wisdom Story. Don't forget to subscribe to get the latest videos. Wishing you joy and peace. The chilly night wind howled, prompting Nathan Carter to hastily zip up his jacket as he stepped out of his car. His vehicle had broken down on a deserted road, as if it had decided to abandon the journey with him. Distant lights from a remote farm glimmered faintly, like a beacon of hope amid the pitch-black night. He knew it was his only chance to find shelter. Each step felt heavier than the last as his boots sank into the damp earth, the path stretching longer than he had anticipated. The eerie sensation of being watched grew stronger with every passing moment as the night swallowed everything around him. Despite the unease creeping into his mind, the weariness of years of success couldn't fill the void in his heart. He pushed the thoughts aside, focusing instead on the reality that he desperately needed help, right now. As he reached the front door, he hesitated. A strange discomfort settled over him, the uneasiness of being a stranger seeking aid from someone he didn't know. He knocked gently, but there was no response. He waited, then knocked harder. This time, the sound of footsteps echoed from within, reverberating against the wooden floor. The door creaked open slowly, revealing a woman with sharp, questioning eyes. Elena. Nathan recognized her instantly, the way she stood, guarded, as if unused to welcoming strangers. Her hands gripped the door firmly, barring him from stepping in. She scrutinized him closely, her gaze as piercing as a blade. "Who are you?" she asked, skipping pleasantries, her tone filled with suspicion. Ethan removed his hat instinctively, a gesture of respect. But it was clear it didn't leave an impression. "My car broke down a few miles back," he explained, gesturing towards the darkness behind him. "I don't have any signal or anywhere to stay the night. I was hoping you could help." Elena frowned, her skepticism unrelenting. Living alone in an isolated place like this, trust didn't come easily. Yet something in Ethan's eyes, perhaps the weariness they held, made her reconsider. "Are you alone?" she asked, still cautious. Ethan nodded. "Yes, just me. I don't mean to bother you. I just need a place to rest until morning." Elena stayed silent for a long moment, the air between them thick with tension. Finally, she sobbed, as if conceding to his desperation, and opened the door slightly wider. "I have a room outside, in the barn. It's simple but safe. You can stay there for the night." Relief washed over Ethan, and he managed a faint smile, trying not to appear too desperate. "Thank you. I truly appreciate it." Elena opened the door a little more, but the wariness in her eyes lingered. "It's cold out there. I'll prepare the room for you. In the meantime, you can have some coffee." Her tone wasn't exactly inviting, but there was an air of reluctant acceptance. Ethan nodded gratefully and stepped inside. The interior was warm but modest, reflecting the harshness of rural life. The furniture was old but well kept. The living room held only a worn leather sofa, a small bookshelf with a few books, and minimal decor. But the space carries a certain essence, something familiar that makes Ethan feel as if he'd stepped into a faint memory of the past. As he walked further in, his gaze landed on a corner of the room, where soft light illuminated a marble sculpture. Ethan's heart skipped a beat. He it instantly. Every curve, every detail of the piece was unmistakable. It was Isabel's work, the woman he had loved so deeply more than 20 years ago. The whole world seemed to freeze as memories Ethan had long buried resurfaced, powerful and overwhelming. He stood motionless, his eyes locked on the sculpture, unable to look away. Every curve, every detail of the piece reminded him of days filled with happiness yet steeped in sorrow, as if time had never passed. Elena walked into the room, carrying 2 steaming cups of coffee. She immediately noticed Ethan's fixed gaze on the sculpture. "Beautiful, isn't it?" she said, setting 1 cup on the table. Her voice tried to sound casual, but her eyes carefully observed his reaction. Ethan took a deep breath, struggling to steady himself. "It's truly remarkable," he replied, his voice masking the storm of emotions within. "Your mother made this, didn't she?" Elena nodded lightly, her gaze also drifting to the sculpture, as if recalling something distant. "Yes, my mother was an artist. She created a few pieces before we moved here. She loved art, but she doesn't create anymore." Her words hit Ethan like a shockwave. Isabel, the woman he had loved and left behind in Europe, was Elena's mother. How had he not known? How could he not have recognized this connection? Questions swirled in his mind, but he knew he couldn't reveal the truth just yet. Elena seemed to sense his unease. "You seem familiar with her work," she said, tilting her head in curiosity. Ethan hesitated before answering. "I think I do," he said, his voice heavy with emotion. "Your mother, she lived in Europe before coming here, didn't she?" Elena frowned slightly but nodded. "Yes, she left Europe many years ago and came here for a quieter life." Ethan gripped the coffee cup in his hands, memories flooding back with an intensity that took his breath away. The past he thought he had forgotten was now clearer than ever. But he knew this was only the beginning of a story fate was forcing them to confront. Under the dim light, Elena frowned, her eyes sharp and suspicious as they bore into Nathan. "Yes, my mother never talked much about that part of her life." "Why are you asking?" Her voice was low, tinged with clear wariness. Nathan turned back to the sculpture, feeling a lump tighten in his throat. He took a deep breath and answered, his voice weighted with gravity. I think I knew your mother, many years ago." Elena's gaze remained fixed on him, now tinged with something beyond suspicion, something unsettled, as if she were piecing together a fragmented memory. "My mother never mentioned you," she said slowly, her words deliberate and cutting. Nathan closed his eyes for a moment, feeling the weight of what he was about to say. "I spent some time in Europe," he began, his eyes returning to the sculpture. "Back then, I met an artist named Isabel. We were in love." Elena stayed rooted to the spot, her expression shifting between doubt and a flicker of recognition. "My mother never spoke of you," she repeated, her voice trembling slightly but firm. Nathan bowed his head, the tension in the room thick enough to suffocate. "I didn't know," he murmured, his voice barely audible. "I didn't know she had a child." Silence engulfed the room. Elena crossed her arms, her sharp gaze never leaving Nathan. "My mother wasn't the kind of woman to leave someone behind, especially if they truly mattered to her," she said, her tone as cold as the night wind outside. Nathan clenched his hands tightly, guilt rising within him like a storm. He knew she was right. Isabel had never told him she was pregnant. "I didn't know," he repeated, his voice breaking. "If I had known, I would have come back for her." Elena's lips curled into a faint, bitter smile. "But she didn't tell you," she said, her words cutting like a blade. "And now, she's gone. There's nothing you can do to change that." Her words struck Nathan like a hammer blow. He stared at Elena, the daughter of Isabel, a child he had never known existed. But Elena's eyes were distant, as if he were merely a shadow in the life she and her mother had built from loss. Turning her back to him, Elena moved to the window and gazed out into the dark expanse. My mother moved here when I was very young, she said, her voice heavy with reminiscence. It was always just the two of us. I grew up believing my father was someone who couldn't stay. But she never told me who he was or why he left. Nathan took a step forward, desperate to bridge the gap between them. If I had known, I would have come back, he said, his voice raw with regret. Elena turned to face him, her eyes blazing with anger and sorrow. But you didn't know. And now, it doesn't matter. She's gone, and there's nothing you can do to fix that. Her words left Nathan frozen in place. The room was silent except for the wind howling outside, a chilling reminder of the void Isabel had left behind. Nathan stood there, the weight of years of regret pressing heavily on his heart. He looked at Elena, his daughter, but her gaze held nothing but coldness and distance. How could he mend a relationship that had shattered before it even began? How could he atone for his mistakes? Yet deep down, he knew forgiveness might never be something he deserved. Elena took a deep breath, her voice resolute as she spoke. I'll show you a room where you can spend the night. In the morning, you can find someone to fix your car. I think, it's best if you leave. Her tone was cold and final, leaving Nathan no chance to respond. She picked up the lantern from the table and opened the wooden door. A rush of icy air swept in, causing them both to shiver. Outside, the farm was cloaked in darkness, isolated from the world. Only the howling wind and faint animal sounds from afar broke the silence. Elena led Nathan across the yard, her steps firm on the pitch-black path. They stopped in front of a small barn, separated from the main house. It was a simple, rustic structure, but enough to shelter someone for a night. Elena unlocked the door, its wooden hinges creaking as it swung open, revealing a modest room dimly lit by the oil lamp she had just lit. Inside, there was only a single bed, a worn chair, and a small wooden table with a neatly placed pitcher of water. The room was far from luxurious but offered a sense of safety amidst the isolation of the night. You can stay here, Elena said, her voice devoid of warmth, making it clear she wanted to maintain her distance. Nathan nodded, feeling the weight of her words settle on his shoulders, not just because of what she said, but also because of the harsh truth he had just uncovered. He wanted to say something to ease the tension, but he knew that any words he uttered now would be meaningless. Elena handed him the key, her eyes avoiding his. Lock the door when you're done. I don't want anything left open at night. Without waiting for a reply, she turned and walked away, her figure fading into the cold mist of the dark night. Nathan stood there for a long moment, watching the small but resolute silhouette disappear. He felt the loneliness engulf him before stepping into the room and shutting the door behind him. Sitting on the simple bed, the room fell into silence. But in his mind, the image of Isabel's sculpture was vivid, like a carving that could never be erased. He thought back to those distant days in France, in her small studio. How the twilight had illuminated her face as she worked on her sculptures, the gentle smile that always graced her lips when she completed a piece. The memories now surged back, both beautiful and agonizing. Nathan pressed his hands to his face, his eyes shutting tightly, his heart heavy. He couldn't understand how a life built on ambition and success had led him back to where it all began. Isabel was gone forever. And Elena, his daughter, looked at him as if he were a stranger who had never cared. Regret flooded Nathan's heart. He knew he had failed, not just in love but in the most significant responsibility of his life, being a father. He lay down on the stiff bed, listening to the wind howl outside, his only companion in the solitude. Yet, Nathan was certain of one thing: he couldn't leave tomorrow. He couldn't escape this reality without trying to fix the mistakes of his past. But how could he even begin when everything seemed irreparable? The night stretched endlessly. Sleep came to him in fragmented pieces, each moment interrupted by vivid images: Isabel's face, the shimmering light on her sculpture, and the mix of anger and pain in Elena's eyes. Memories and emotions intertwined, forming a haunting melody that gnawed at his heart. In the darkness, Nathan silently wondered, was there still a chance for him to make amends? Or was it far too late to reclaim what had been lost? Sadness lingered on Ethan's face as the first rays of morning sunlight streamed through the small window. He was awake, yet his mind churned like an overworked machine, bracing for whatever the new day might bring. Dawn arrived quietly, the soft light painting the vast fields in golden hues. Ethan rose from the stiff bed in the barn, feeling the exhaustion from a restless night weigh on his body. He dressed quickly and stepped outside, letting the crisp morning air brush against his face. The chill was biting, but the freshness seemed to whisper promises of something new. As he made his way toward the main house, Ethan stopped in his tracks when he spotted Elena. She had risen early and was tending to the horses in the yard. Her movements were deliberate and confident, each step reflecting her familiarity with the work. She appeared as someone accustomed to carrying the burdens of life alone. Ethan lingered from a distance, hesitating. He didn't know how to approach her. Too much remained unsaid, and he had no idea where to start. Sensing his gaze, Elena abruptly broke the silence without looking up. "Have you made up your mind yet?" Her tone was sharp and unwavering, her hands continuing to brush the horse's coat with practiced ease. Ethan stepped closer, stopping just a few feet away from her. I want to talk to you," he said, his voice filled with hesitation. At last, Elena looked up, her gaze icy and unyielding. "There's nothing left to say, Ethan. You've already said everything that needed to be said." Her words sliced through the crisp morning air like a knife. Ethan took a deep breath, fighting the instinct to defend himself. He knew he needed to stay calm, to choose his words carefully if he wanted even the slightest chance of reaching her. "I know I have no right to ask for anything," Ethan began cautiously. "And I know no words can change what happened, or didn't happen. But I didn't know Isabel was pregnant. If I had known, I would have come back. I would never have left." Elena's expression darkened, her jaw tightening. His words seemed only to harden her resolve, layering her face with skepticism and pain. "And what exactly do you think that would have changed?" she replied bitterly. "The truth is, my mother loved you, and you left her. You left her alone to raise me. She faced everything on her own. And now, after all these years, you show up. What do you expect? That I'll just accept you?" Her words hit Ethan like a slap. He could feel the weight of their truth and knew he had no right to expect forgiveness. In fact, he wasn't even sure forgiveness was possible. But something inside him refused to give up. "I'm not asking for your forgiveness," he said quietly. "I know it's too late, but I'm here now, and I want to understand. I want to know my daughter." Elena took a step back, her eyes sharp as daggers. "I'm not your daughter," she said, her voice firm but laced with a hint of pain. "You may be my biological father, but I didn't grow up with you. My mother was the only family I ever had." Her words lodged like a lump in Ethan's throat. He knew they were true, and that only made them harder to bear. Ethan tried to shift the conversation, softening his tone. "What about the farm?" he asked. "I can see you're struggling. Let me help. I know it's not enough, but at least let me do something." Elena's gaze turned colder. "I don't need your help," she said flatly. "I don't need you to fix my life, just like my mother didn't need you. We both managed without you. And I'll keep managing." Ethan stepped forward again, his eyes pleading for a chance. "I'm not trying to fix anything," he said earnestly. "I just want you to know that if you ever need me, I'll be here." Elena stood motionless for a long moment, her piercing eyes seeming to search for the truth in his words. But she said nothing. Turning away, she resumed tending to the horse, signaling that the conversation was over. Ethan remained rooted to the spot, feeling more helpless than ever. He knew he couldn't force Elena to accept his presence. But he also knew that deep down, he couldn't leave. Something inside him wouldn't allow it. He turned and walked away, giving Elena the space she needed. As he wandered through the fields, he noticed the worn state of the farm. Fences needed mending, the barn showed its age, and the crops lacked vitality. It was clear that Elena was doing her best to keep everything together, but she was doing it alone. The thought of helping began to take root in Ethan's mind. But before he could dwell on it further, a voice called out from behind him. Turning, he saw Thomas, one of Elena's neighbors, approaching. The man's rugged build and sharp gaze hinted that the upcoming conversation would be anything but easy. Thomas's tall, sturdy figure, hardened from a lifetime of farm work, came into focus under the pale morning light. His eyes locked onto Ethan with a mix of suspicion and disdain. "You're the one who showed up last night, right?" Thomas asked bluntly. Ethan nodded, feeling slightly uneasy at the man's confrontational tone. "Yes, my car broke down on the road, and Elena was kind enough to let me stay the night." Thomas stopped a few feet away, crossing his arms over his chest as his voice grew sharper. "So who are you? And why are you really here?" Ethan hesitated. He wasn't sure what, if anything, Elena had told Thomas. But from the man's steely gaze, Ethan knew earning his trust would be a challenge. Ethan took a deep breath. "I knew Elena's mother, a long time ago. But I didn't know she had a daughter, not until last night. I came here to find out what happened." Thomas let out a bitter, heavy laugh. "Of course. Another man showing up too late, hoping to fix everything. Another one with good intentions." He stepped closer, his face just inches from Ethan's. "Let me make this clear to you, Elena doesn't need you. She's already endured enough on her own. The last thing she needs is someone showing up out of nowhere thinking they can make everything right." Ethan swallowed hard, fighting to keep calm. "I'm not here to fix anything," he replied, his voice low and earnest. "I just want to help." Thomas sighed, disappointment etched into his face. "If you really want to help, the best thing you can do is leave. Leave her alone." Thomas's words echoed in Ethan's mind as the older man turned and walked away, leaving him standing there alone. Maybe Thomas was right. Maybe the best thing he could do was leave, let Elena continue her life undisturbed. But something deep inside Ethan refused to accept that. He couldn't leave. Not now. Not after everything. That evening, as Elena prepared dinner, the silence between them hung heavy, almost unbearable. Ethan watched her, her hands working methodically, but her distant eyes betrayed the storm of thoughts swirling within her. "Elena," he began, his voice steady but subdued. She looked up, her gaze cold and unyielding. "I can't just walk away without doing anything. I know you don't know me, and I know you have no reason to trust me. But I'm your father, and I want to do whatever I can to help. Even if it's too late." Elena stared at him for a long moment, her eyes unwavering. The silence stretched between them like an unbridgeable chasm before she finally spoke, her tone icy and detached. "I don't need you, Ethan. I never have." With those words, she stood and walked away from the table, leaving Ethan sitting alone, his thoughts spiraling. The next morning, gray clouds blanketed the sky over the farm, signaling a somber day ahead. But the growing sense of urgency in Ethan wouldn't let him remain idle. He knew the farm was on the brink of collapse. And no matter how strong and determined Elena was, she was fighting an uphill battle. Even after their tense conversation the previous night, where she briefly admitted the struggles she was facing, Ethan could still feel the impenetrable wall of pride between them. Elena refused any help. As he walked across the farm, he noticed the rotting fences, the sagging barns, and the overgrown fields. The thought that he could do something to change the situation took firmer root in his mind. He had connections, resources he could leverage to provide both financial and structural support for the farm. But was it the right thing to do? If he acted, he risked shattering any chance of reconciliation with Elena by going behind her back. The sky grew heavier, and time didn't seem to be on their side. From a distance, Ethan could see the main house and Elena's figure framed in the window. She stood there, her gaze weary, her small shoulders burdened with too much. He knew he had to act. But how could he help without making her feel betrayed? The question weighed heavily on Ethan's heart as he stood there, facing the new day and a decision that could change everything. Ethan stood by the small window in the living room, his phone in hand. His voice was low but urgent as he spoke to Charles, an old friend and financial lawyer. "Charles, this has to be done discreetly," Ethan said, his gaze fixed on the distant farm. "She can't know the money is coming from me." Charles's voice on the other end was calm but firm. "I understand, Ethan. I'll arrange it. The farm will have enough funds to avoid bankruptcy for now. But you know, eventually, she'll find out." Ethan ran a hand over his forehead, feeling the weight of those words. "I know. But right now, all I need is time. Time to figure out how to fix this for good." Charles agreed, his steady tone a source of reassurance in the chaos. "I'll handle it. But Ethan, remember, not every problem can be solved with money." That afternoon, after another failed attempt to talk to Elena, Ethan walked slowly toward the main house. The cold wind swept through the farm, carrying the scent of dry earth and withering grass. Ethan was stopped in his tracks by Thomas, the longtime manager of the farm. Thomas's face was more scowled than usual, his eyes gleaming with frustration. "Listen, Ethan," Thomas began firmly. "I don't know what your plan is, but it's time for you to leave. Elena doesn't need you, and all you're doing is complicating things further." Ethan sighed, bracing himself for yet another confrontation. But this time, he decided to take a different approach. "Thomas," Ethan said, striving to keep his tone calm, "I understand you're worried about her. I know you've been here for her far longer than I have. But you need to understand that I'm worried about Elena too. And no matter how strong she is, she can't keep this farm running much longer." Thomas let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. "You think you can just show up after all these years, throw some money around, and play the hero? It's not that simple, Ethan. Elena doesn't need a savior." Ethan felt anger rise within him but held it back. He knew Thomas was protecting Elena, even if his approach was blunt. "I'm not trying to be a hero, Thomas," Ethan said, his voice steady and resolute. "I'm just trying to do the right thing. I know I've made mistakes. I know I can't change the past. But I'm here now, and I'm not leaving just because you see me as a problem." Thomas shook his head, clearly dissatisfied. "You're only making things messier, Reed. What she needs is stability, not another complication." The tension between the two men was palpable, stretched tight like a bowstring about to snap. But before the argument could escalate, Elena appeared, striding quickly toward them. "What's going on here?" Elena demanded, her voice sharp, her gaze darting between the two. Thomas opened his mouth to speak, but Ethan quickly intervened. "Elena, we were just discussing the state of the farm," Ethan explained. Her eyes narrowed, displeasure clear in her expression. "I've already told you I don't need your help, Ethan. And Thomas, I don't need you fighting my battles for me either." A tense silence followed. Thomas looked at Elena, his face softening slightly, though the disappointment remained evident. "I'm just trying to protect you," he said, his voice quieter now. Elena sighed, running a hand through her hair. She looked exhausted, and Ethan couldn't help but notice the dark circles under her eyes, evidence of sleepless nights. "I know," Elena replied, her tone gentler. "But I can take care of myself." Thomas nodded, though his face betrayed his lingering doubt. He cast one last look at Ethan before walking away, returning to his unfinished tasks. With just the two of them remaining, Elena turned to Ethan, arms crossed over her chest. "Why are you still here?" she asked bluntly. Ethan exhaled, meeting her gaze directly. "Because I'm not leaving until I've done what I can to help you." Elena shook her head, as if too drained to argue further. "I've told you, I don't need your help." Ethan stepped closer, his eyes filled with determination. "Elena, this isn't just about you. It's about the farm, about what your mother built. You're on the verge of losing everything, and I won't stand by and let that happen." Elena stared at him, her expression a mix of defiance and something deeper, an emotion he couldn't quite place. In that moment, it became clear to both of them that this wasn't just a fight for the farm's survival. It was about forgiveness, reconciliation, and memories too precious to let go. Her face hardened again, but this time Ethan noticed something different, perhaps a flicker of sadness, perhaps a fleeting disappointment. Those emotions echoed silently in the air, slipping through the words she spoke next. "And what will you do? Throw money at these problems and hope they disappear? That won't solve anything, Ethan. It won't bring my mother back. It won't undo what's happened." Ethan felt something tighten in his chest. She was right, and he knew it. But deep down, he also knew that without his intervention, she would lose everything, not just the farm, but the cherished memories of her mother. "I know money can't fix everything," Ethan said, his voice softer now, laced with vulnerability. "But it can buy you time. And time is what you need right now." Silence stretched between them like an invisible wall, making every word that followed feel heavier. Elena's eyes searched his, as if trying to find something, truth, perhaps, or maybe trust. "You don't understand, Ethan," she finally said, her voice dropping to a near whisper, resigned. "I don't want to rely on you. I don't want to feel like I'm only here because you decided to show up and fix everything." Ethan stepped closer, his gaze softening, his voice steady with conviction. "This isn't about you depending on me. It's about doing what's right. I wasn't here before, but I'm here now, and I won't leave just because you think I'm a problem." Elena shook her head, her eyes heavy with unspoken words. She tried to keep her composure, but the weariness was evident. "I don't know if I can trust you," she murmured, her voice trembling like a fragile thread barely holding together. Ethan felt a sharp pang in his chest. He knew nothing could undo the past, but he couldn't give up, couldn't stand by while she endured alone. "All I'm asking for is a chance," Ethan said, his voice a quiet plea, almost a promise to himself. "Elena, just one chance." She stood there, her eyes fixed on the ground as if wrestling with a choice she didn't want to make. Time stretched, an endless silence hanging between them, until finally, she whispered, "I'll think about it." Then she turned and walked away, leaving Ethan standing there, feeling the weight of unspoken words swirling around him. Yet, this time, in his heart, there was a flicker of hope, a chance he might be able to make things right, to help her start again. The farm remained unchanged, its steady hum of life surrounding Ethan as he stood at the edge of the field, watching Elena go about her morning routine. But no matter how it looked, he knew the weight of days past lingered in the air between them. This time, however, as he gazed at the farm, Ethan wasn't just an outsider looking in. He had kept his word, staying back to give Elena the space she needed. But the survival of the farm required more than silence. He knew he had to act, and he had to act now. Elena started her day as she always did, feeding the horses and moving through the yard with determined steps. Yet Ethan couldn't ignore the telltale signs of exhaustion etched into her face. Her strength had its limits, and he knew she'd never ask for help. But Ethan couldn't let her face it all alone. He needed to find a way to help without making her feel like she was losing control. As he crossed the yard, he felt the morning sunlight creeping over his shoulder, casting long shadows across the barren fields. A new day had begun, and Ethan knew the road ahead would be difficult, but he was ready to fight, for Elena, for the farm, and for everything he had left undone for her. Ethan's footsteps crunched softly against the gravel as he approached Elena near the stables. The somber morning air hung heavy around them. He stopped a few feet away, his voice breaking the stillness. "We need to talk about the future," he said, a statement that couldn't be avoided. Elena glanced at him briefly, her hands still busy with the farm chores, but her eyes betrayed her unease. "The future?" she repeated, her tone indifferent but tinged with apprehension. "The future of this place," Ethan clarified, gesturing toward the vast expanse of the farm, a land shaped by years of sweat and effort. "You can't keep running yourself into the ground like this. We need a plan. A real plan. And it starts with asking for help." Elena paused, wiping her hands on her worn jeans before turning to face him. Her expression was unreadable, but her eyes revealed the toll of exhaustion she had worked so hard to conceal. "There's no we in this," she said, her voice sharp and cold, as if to push him away. "This is my problem. You just got here." Ethan stepped closer, careful to maintain the space she needed. He had learned not to overstep her boundaries. "I've been here longer than you think," he said, his voice low and steady. "I've been working behind the scenes to make sure this farm doesn't collapse." Elena frowned, confusion flashing across her face. "What do you mean?" Ethan took a deep breath, hesitating for a moment. He hadn't wanted to reveal this so soon but knew he couldn't keep it from her any longer. "I've been working with Charles, my attorney, to set up an emergency fund for the farm. It's not a permanent solution, but it'll cover the debts and buy us time to rebuild." He paused, gauging her reaction, then added, "I wanted to tell you earlier, but I wasn't sure of everything." A heavy silence fell between them, broken only by the faint whisper of the wind. Elena stared at him, her eyes a storm of emotions he couldn't decipher. The air between them grew heavier with each passing second. Finally, she crossed her arms, her gaze narrowing with skepticism. "What did you do?" she asked, her voice low and tightly controlled, but Ethan could feel the anger simmering beneath her words. "You did what you thought was right." "I'm not trying to take over," Ethan quickly responded, raising his hands as if to defuse the tension. "I just want to help you. I know you don't want to take my money, and I respect that, but this isn't just about money. It's about saving everything your mom worked so hard to build." Elena shook her head, stepping back. "You think you can just throw money at this and fix everything?" "No, that's not how it works, Ethan. You can't just walk in here and decide what's best for me." Ethan held his ground, his voice steady but firm. "I'm not trying to decide what's best for you. I'm trying to do what's right for the farm. If you lose everything your mom built, what will you have left?" Elena looked at him, her eyes clouded with worry. Her face hardened, but beneath the tough exterior, Ethan saw something else, fear of being hurt. And beneath that, an exhaustion she could no longer hide. Finally, she sighed, her voice softening. "Why didn't you ask me first?" Ethan felt a pang in his chest. "Because I knew you'd say no," he replied, his voice tinged with sadness but filled with honesty. Elena stared at him in silence, her gaze searching his words for the truth. But no explanation could erase the doubts lingering in her heart. At last, she turned away, saying nothing more, though deep down, she knew Ethan's persistence might just change everything. Ethan stood there, watching Elena with determined eyes. He felt every heavy breath, the weight of everything that had happened in recent days pressing on his shoulders. "I can't just stand by and watch this place fall apart when there's something I can do to help," he said, his voice resolute but empathetic. Elena turned away, her hand resting on the stable door. She took a deep breath, as though trying to steady the emotions rising within her. "You should trust me," she said slowly, her tone deliberate and layered with meaning. "I make my own decisions." "I do trust you," Ethan replied, his voice calm yet firm. But trust works both ways. I need you to believe that I'm not here to take anything from you. I just want to help. For the first time since their argument, Elena didn't respond with sharp words or a forceful rejection. Instead, she stood in silence, her eyes drifting toward the horizon, toward the field stretching beyond the stables. Ethan waited, unsure if he'd said too much or if he'd finally begun to chip away at the walls she'd built around herself. The silence stretched on, feeling like an eternity. Finally, Elena spoke, her voice soft but carrying the weight of her struggles. I've been trying to hold everything together, and it's too much. Ethan stepped closer but kept a respectful distance. He placed his hand gently on the stable door, his gesture steady and reassuring. You don't have to do this alone anymore, he said, his voice warm. Yet firm, a promise he wouldn't break. Elena turned to face him, her eyes meeting his. For the first time, there was something softer in her gaze, perhaps recognition, maybe even a flicker of gratitude. She didn't say anything more, but in that moment, no words were needed. I'll let you help, she whispered, her voice nearly breaking but still strong enough to reach him. But that doesn't mean I'm forgiving you or that everything's okay. Ethan nodded, his expression calm yet understanding. I'm not asking for that. Just let me help. Elena didn't reply, but she didn't walk away either. For Ethan, that was enough. Raindrops began to fall, their gentle patter on the farm windows creating a somber melody that mirrored the quiet weight of the morning. Ethan stood by the window, watching the rain collect and slide down the glass. He felt the gravity of everything that had happened, the choices, the changes that couldn't be undone. For now, the farm had been saved, but the distance between him and Elena, between the man and the woman, was still vast. As he turned away, he heard soft footsteps. Elena stood in the doorway, her arms crossed, her expression guarded. But no longer cold. She didn't accuse him anymore, her words were more of an observation than a challenge. You're still here, she said quietly, not with anger, but as though it was a fact she had come to accept. Ethan nodded, a faint smile playing on his lips. I told you, I'm staying. He stepped toward her, his eyes filled with quiet resolve and unwavering care. Elena didn't reply but didn't walk away either. She stepped into the room, sat down at the old wooden table, and motioned for Ethan to join her. The tension still lingered, but it was no longer sharp, it was softer, as if they were standing at the threshold of something fragile and new, where one wrong move could shatter everything. I've been thinking about the farm, Elena began, her voice low and contemplative. About everything my mother built. I can't let it fall apart, and I know you're right. I can't do this alone. Ethan sat across from her, feeling a sense of relief that she had come to this realization on her own. But he also knew this wasn't just about the farm. It was about trust, about the connection between two people who had spent so much time apart. I don't want to take anything away from you, he said gently. Ethan stood before Elena, sensing the tension in the air but also something different. The steadfast determination he had held onto for so long softened, replaced by sincerity in his words. I just want to make sure you don't lose everything your mother worked so hard to give you, he said, each word gentle but resolute. Elena didn't respond immediately. Her eyes met his, and for the first time in days, there was no anger or defensiveness in her gaze. Instead, there was exhaustion, weariness, and perhaps a faint hint of acceptance, though she wouldn't admit it. So, do you think I can trust you now? Elena sighed, her voice soft but filled with skepticism. Ethan didn't rush his response. He didn't expect her to trust him right away. I don't expect you to trust me yet, he replied, his tone calm but earnest. But I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere. I'll do whatever it takes to help you, and I'll wait as long as it takes for you to trust me. Elena didn't say anything at first. She leaned back in the old wooden chair, her eyes fixed on her hands resting on the table, as if searching for answers in her own thoughts. After a long pause, she spoke, her voice breaking slightly. My mother never told me much about you, she never explained what happened between you two. All I knew was that you weren't there, and I spent my whole life wondering why. What could have been so important that you couldn't stay? Ethan felt a wave of guilt wash over him. The years of separation, the choices he now knew were mistakes, came rushing back. If I had known she was pregnant, I would have come back. I never would have left her to raise you on her own. He paused, his voice lowering as he struggled to articulate the inexpressible. Elena looked up, her eyes filled with a mixture of anger and hurt. But you did leave. And after that, my mother never mentioned you again. I grew up believing I didn't need you, that I could be fine without a father. But now, you're here, and I don't know how to feel about it. Ethan knew he couldn't change the past or undo the years he had missed. But he also couldn't let the young woman in front of him carry that pain alone any longer. I can't change the past, and I can't erase the years I wasn't there for you, but I'm here now, and I want to be part of your life. If you'll let me. Elena lowered her gaze, her shoulders slumping slightly as his words seemed to reopen long-buried wounds. I don't know how to let you in, she whispered. I've spent so much time pushing people away, trying to prove I didn't need anyone, it's hard to undo that. Ethan exhaled deeply but kept his tone gentle and patient. You don't have to do it all at once. We can take it slow. I just want you to know I'm not going anywhere. I'm here for the long haul. The silence between them stretched out, broken only by the soft patter of rain on the windows, a mournful melody in the stillness of the room. Without any more words, the atmosphere between them shifted. It was no longer heavy with tension or weighed down by anger. Instead, there was a quiet acknowledgement of past wounds and a faint, fragile hope for healing. Elena turned to him, her voice barely above a whisper. I've been scared that if I let you in, you'll leave again. And I don't think I could handle that. Her words were like a breeze stirring something deep within Ethan. He stood and moved toward her, his heart heavy yet full of resolve. I won't leave. No matter what happens, I'll stay, and I'll help you, one step at a time. In that moment, everything seemed to quiet, leaving only a tenuous but profound trust. It wasn't a grand resolution but a beginning, a chance for them to find a way forward. Ethan stood silently, his eyes locked with Elena's as her words pierced him. I hear the pain in your voice, he said with quiet sincerity. I understand it, but this time, I won't leave. I promise you, Elena. Elena met his gaze, her expression still uncertain, but something in her seemed to shift. She nodded slowly, each movement carrying the weight of her hesitation and hope. I guess I'll have to trust you on that. Ethan smiled gently. There's no rush. Just one step at a time, he said, his voice calm and patient. And with that, a small but significant step was taken. In the weeks that followed, the farm slowly began to come back to life, thanks to Ethan's financial support and Elena's tireless efforts. Together, they worked to repair the damage and restore every part of the land her mother had built. Crops began to grow again, and for the first time in a long while, there was a glimmer of hope. But for Ethan and Elena, the most challenging task wasn't restoring the farm, it was rebuilding their relationship. Little by little, old wounds began to heal, though it wasn't easy. There were still tense moments, times when the pain of the past resurfaced to remind them of all the lost years. However, those moments became less frequent, and the distance between them slowly began to close. One afternoon, as they worked together repairing a section of fencing, Elena glanced at Ethan, her expression contemplative. I've been thinking about something, she said, her voice thoughtful. Ethan looked up, wiping sweat from his brow, curiosity in his eyes. What is it? Elena hesitated for a moment, as if carefully choosing her words. My mother always wanted this place to be a legacy, a place that would last for generations. But I don't think she ever imagined I'd be doing it alone. I think she would have wanted you to be a part of it. Ethan's chest tightened at her heartfelt words. It was the first time Elena had openly spoken about her mother, about her hopes and dreams. He watched her, emotion swelling in his heart. I think she would have asked you to be a part of it, Elena continued. Ethan nodded quietly. I agree, he said, his tone steady yet filled with emotion. And I want to be a part of it, if you'll let me. Elena met his gaze, her eyes steady but introspective. I guess, we can figure it out together. For the first time, the weight of the past seemed to lift, even just a little. While the scars remained and the memories lingered, something new was beginning to take shape. A real chance to start over and build something better. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, its golden light bathing the fields, Ethan and Elena sat together on the porch, watching the sky shift to shades of pink and orange. The silence between them was no longer awkward. It was filled with a quiet understanding, as if they were both moving forward together, one step at a time. Elena broke the silence first, her voice soft but brimming with emotion. Thank you for not giving up. Ethan smiled, warmth flooding his heart, a feeling he hadn't experienced in years. I never did, he said. And for the first time in a long time, he felt like he was home. Their story wasn't just about mending old wounds, it was about creating a family, a place where they could live, grow, and build together without ever giving up on one another. Thank you for following this story to the end. What are your thoughts on it? If you enjoyed it, don't forget to hit like and subscribe to my channel for more stories like this. And please share your thoughts in the comments, I'd love to hear from you.